Change begins from within. As easy as it is to look outside of ourselves and want the world to change, the truth is, it never will if we remain the same. This podcast was created for changemakers like you who want more love and connection in your community. Today, you are going to hear stories that will inspire you and also challenge you to be the change. We are going to go deep, my friend. So take a deep breath and settle in. My name is Emilia Tamburini. Welcome to the Circle of Change. Welcome to the spring season of Circle of Change. It is great to be here with you. I hope wherever you are feeling the shift in the seasons. There's also a huge shift occurring in our planetary world right now, where Pluto has just entered a new sign for the first time since 2008. This particular shift empowers the masses to organize, mobilize, and disrupt the systems that have failed us. And Pluto will be hanging out here until 2044. So we are literally entering into a new era. I am so excited about this transition. I've been ready, waiting, and preparing for this era my entire life. And guess what? So have you. Because you're listening to this conversation and you tune into this podcast, I know that you are also ready to play your part in this necessary transition because you have been learning, staying curious, and building the ways of being that the world needs right now. This is one of the many reasons I am so grateful for the conversation you're about to hear, because it gives us the tools, the ways of being, the places to dive into, to lead and navigate this change in a good way. This conversation reminds us of the importance of the ancient teachings that hold the wisdom to guide us at this time. And it is a beautiful example of what is to come and what is possible for our organizations and communities. Today, we are sitting in a circle with Joan Brown and Scott Saywell. Mr. Saywell is the superintendent of Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools. He holds a Master of Arts in Educational Leadership from San Diego State University and a Bachelor of Education and Science from Mount Allison University. In his 32 years of service in education, he has focused his attention on improving life chances for the most unique, disadvantaged, and vulnerable learners, and you will hear that through the stories that he shares today. Joining Scott is Joan Brown. She is a beautiful soul and a lifetime administrator. She is currently holding the role of Chief Administrative Officer for the Snuneymuxw First Nation. She is also a storyteller. She's a knowledge keeper and a community leader whose voice is creating waves of change in the circles that she gets to sit in. She has played a pivotal role in shifting my own worldview, and I'm so grateful to bring her wisdom and voice to you in this circle. In this episode, you will hear of an example of two people with different backgrounds that come together for a greater purpose. We learn why turning toward the land is the path forward. Scott and Joan illustrate for us what it means and what it takes to walk in two worlds, and how to stay true to ourselves as we move forward. And we leave with a deeper understanding of the work that is urgent right now. I believe that listening to this conversation is urgent. So I invite you to clear whatever it is you are doing and take in the words being shared. They are here for you. Thank you for your presence. Enjoy. Joan and Scott, welcome to the Circle of Change.
Hi, Emilia. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Emilia. Happy to see you.
It's a true joy for me to get to sit here in this way with you. So the listener is aware, I have been connected with Joan and Scott through a land development project that is called Te Tuxton. And it involves many partners and many moving parts. Through our interactions together and gatherings, it was really clear to me that the two of you had a special relationship. that was forged through a lot of work and deep commitment to doing things in a new way, in a way that really honored reconciliation, a concept that many folks are struggling with in terms of trying to understand what that even means. And so I'm really excited for this conversation because when I think about the circle of change, it's really about how do we action change? How do we be as change makers to co-create a new world? And I think you two are like living, breathing examples of what this actually means. So I'm really honored to sit here with you and grateful for the stories that will be shared today. So I'm going to start, as we do here, by settling us in, and then I'll read a poem. So Joan and Scott, feel free to participate as you wish, but for the listener, if you're in a safe space to do so, I invite you to close your eyes and take a moment to get present here in this space, in this circle conversation. You might want to just feel your feet on the ground and feel that support from Mother Earth. And as you feel that support, take in a few breaths. Really connecting with that breath, that beautiful tool that we all have to ground ourselves right here in the moment, which we are so rarely ever in. And as you take those deep breaths and settle into this space, I'm going to read a poem. And the poem is by Joy Harjo, who is a Native American poet laureate of the United States. And the poem is called The Story Wheel. I leave you to your ceremony of grieving, which is also of celebration, given when an honored, humbled one leaves behind a trail of happiness in the dark of human tribulation. None of us is above the other in this story of forever, though we follow that red road home, one behind another. There is a light breaking through the storm, and it is buffalo hunting weather. There you can see your mother. She is busy as she ever was. She holds up a new jingle dress for her youngest beloved daughter, and for her special son, a set of finely beaded gear. All for that welcome home dance, the most favorite of all, when everyone finds their way back together to dance, eat, and celebrate, and tell story after story of how they fought and played in the story wheel and how no one was ever really lost at all. Thank you, Joy, for those words. So, Joan and Scott, we are often steeped as changemakers in this question of who are you? And so it's one question that I'd love to open up with and just to start to explore and introduce the listener to you and see where it takes you. And if you did bring a talking piece into Circle with us today, feel free to introduce it. And whoever wants to start first, whoever feels called, feel free to go ahead. And the question is, who are you?
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you, Scott. Both of you, my beloved friends. I'm so really grateful to be sitting here with you today. My name is Joan Brown. I'm a Nanaimo First Nation born and raised here in the community. I've spent my whole life here and only periodically have left the village. So I've been steeped in traditions throughout my whole life. My career of choice is I've been an administrator for past 40 years. Only once worked with another nation in Victoria, but always First Nation communities. I believe that it's been my role, not knowing till just of lately, that to be kind of a helper, if you will, and trying to keep the traditions and teachings alive within our organization. And, you know, as any administrator, we spend much time in policies, procedures, and budgets and strategic plans. But for me, as one of the senior managers here in Nanaimo, my job is really walking in two worlds, is to make sure we don't go so far down the rabbit hole it takes us away from who we are. It's really with every breath, every step, staying in our teachings is through an organizational lens to help bring help to the community at large. So I've devoted my life to administration and finding just a way to be a different kind of help on a day-to-day basis, something that hopefully will really change how things work for our community because of the level of trauma. And our community is not unique, but we need to find solutions. And that's one of the reasons I work so closely with Scott, is that we're like-minded in many ways, and so grateful for opportunities to work directly with Mr. Saywell. Thank you.
Pasien na siya, Mike Squale, Anthapa Scott Saywell, Tanitsanat Duncan BC, Eatson Manaath Robert Saywell, Geraldine Mann, Entha Uquatl, Nestle C Laath, England Scotland, Siatolitus, Nanemo, Mastimo, Niha Quashesta Tamakatana Quail, Asape Wisiam. Good day, respected friends and relatives. My name is Scott Saywell. I am superintendent of Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools. I was born in Duncan, BC. I am the child of Robert Saywell and Geraldine Mann. They're from Edmonton, Alberta, and I'm connected to England and Scotland through the bloodline of my grandparents. I give my highest praise and appreciation to the people of Snuneymuxw, on whose territory I reside. Thank you, respected ones. Thanks for having us here, Emilia. When I can, I'd like to kind of follow protocol and introduce myself in a way that has been taught to me in the language of the land where I live. Joan and I and the school district and Snuneymuxw First Nation have many projects and partnerships together. Make no mistake about my role here with Joan Brown, and that is to drive her around, open doors for her, and to amplify her voice. Joan and I met as I became superintendent about 5 years ago, and we've been together ever since, trying to share the meaning of walking together, which I'm sure we'll get into, our CIETSIS framework that we have in the school district, and trying to infect a community into a different way of understanding the world. That's the work we do together and separately and always. Isefka.
Beautiful. Thank you both, Joan and Scott. It's already clear. You can just feel the connection that the two of you have. It's beautiful.
We've committed to doing this work, and we'll probably get into the kind of stuff we do and why we're doing it. But Joan and I have, we almost talk every day, but we've committed to meeting every Monday morning at 7:30 for an hour to educate me, for the most part, on that Indigenous worldview, to try and understand that a better way, and to walk a little bit differently on Mother Earth and share those teachings with people around me and the school district, and so we can all learn together. But that's been my focus with Joan for a little while now.
Yeah, thanks for that piece, Scott, because it just starts to illustrate the commitment and what is required in some way to do this well. Before we get into what you're up to together and some of the outcomes that you've been able to create, I love the power of story, and that's sort of what Joy was alluding to in the poem a little bit as we began. But story has a magic to it in that it allows us to connect with each other. And so folks might say, "Oh, well, I'm not Joan Brown. I'm not Scott Saywell. I can't really do this." And sometimes when we share a story, people can start to see themselves in another and understand that maybe we're not so different at our core. This is an invitation for both of you to share a little bit more about your journey, maybe to where you are today in your life and the work that you're doing.
As Scott mentioned, he and I, we do a lot of presentations, and really very, very different backgrounds. My mother, she was a survivor of a residential school. I was a product of Indian day school, Indian hospital, very, very sheltered. I alluded to that. It was really stayed at home. So very different type of background, kind of that historical trauma that comes, just not sure entirely of my place in this world as anyone. Understanding how to walk outside, and for somebody of non-Indigenous world, really Scott's been there through the whole place. I've been an administrator for 40 years. Scott is the first superintendent I've ever met. And so you can appreciate that when he and I travel, we never know what we're going to expect. And so the majority of times we ride together because of the kind of the racism, the comments that we experience as we travel. He's really become a very good guard in that sense and that safety. So for me, when I think about my own personal journey, it's really been about healing. I always say to heal is to learn, and to learn is to heal. And so that when you take on this kind of life of following in the footsteps of the ancestors, doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, we all have a part in this journey, and we all have a place to be a help to our community members. I couldn't get as far as I am without the kind of support that I have from Scott. From a non-Indigenous to an Indigenous world, it's not easy. It's not an easy path. People resist. People have been saying what we're saying for the past 200 years, but it's for the first time the nation is sitting at the table, has a voice, and really to echo the sentiments of the old people is, in my heart and my mind, is profound. So for me, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, is to really recognize that we've all lost something from, not following the brilliance of the old people, because what they've learned is from observing and being with the natural world that's evolved over thousands and thousands of years. So for us, as what was the turning point for Scott and I was we made a commitment to be students of the land. And what brought us together was a love for the people and a love of the land. So, the rest takes care of itself. So this journey is for everyone, all of us, is to start that healing and thinking about looking at the natural world and how she takes care of herself, how much love she has for everyone. Doesn't matter your ethnicity, your age, where you come from. She loves wholeheartedly. And I think that's what we're trying to bring out, is how to really be together. And, like we're so different in background, appearance, everything. It just, people kind of go, oh, we can do this. And I think that's really the message that we're telling by just co-presenting all the time, and especially two very different organizations. It's amazing when we start talking about how our organizations are working together. So I think inspire everybody just to think about where you're at in your own personal journey and how you can bring it to the next level.
Yeah, so I shared that I was born in Duncan, BC, home of the Cowichan tribes, the largest nation in BC. And then I moved to Nanaimo. I lived back east for a little while, but I had to come back to the left coast. The narrative that I was told growing up in central Vancouver Island about Indigenous people, both in school and in the larger community, was negative, it was damaging, and of course it was false. And so as superintendent, I have this responsibility to ensure that the next generation of children are told the truth about Canada's ugly history with our relatives, our Indigenous relatives. And, it's a story that is about Indian residential schools, the 60s scoop, other related policies that are meant to appropriate Indigenous land and eliminate Indigenous people, really cultural genocide, if not genocide itself. So truth and reconciliation has been a significant goal for Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools. We're on our third board of school trustees now that have adopted this goal. Everything we are and everything we try to be in the school district to influence thoughts and actions of our community for the foreseeable future. And we're hoping to improve outcomes for Indigenous students, of course, but also non-Indigenous students. As Joan says, we all lost something. And Joan's the first person that I've ever heard say that we've all lost something. And I think of that often. Hopefully the Indigenous children in schools today will be the first generation of Indigenous people who won't have to heal from their childhood. And this is a long time coming. It'll be my life's work. It'll be the next superintendent's life's work. so that children growing up today will be proud and strong in their culture and language and identity. And, in working with Joan, who says things like, we all lost something, says things like, we're all one. Knowing someone like that can influence you greatly. Like Joan truly believes that. We're all one. I mean, who says that and believes it, Amy Leah? That has a profound influence on me and the great challenge ahead of us as well.
Thank you for sharing those words, both of you. And yeah, I agree. Working with you, Joan, has been a really profound experience in the time we've been able to spend. And there are phrases that you say that I find myself sharing with the communities that I get to work with as well. And that's certainly one of them. The other one is shifting from this sense of entitlement to shared responsibility. I say that a lot. Yeah, you're just a powerful leader and such an honor to get to work alongside. So, Scott, you already referenced the CIETSIS framework. It's a reconciliation framework that Nanaimo Ladysmith School District has adopted and co-created. So CIETSIS is sort of a Hulkamanian expression for walking in two worlds, which you also mentioned. Now, that might be a new concept for some people, although it has come up on this show a number of times. But I'm curious if each of you could share from your own worldview, your own perspective, what does that mean to walk in two worlds?
Comes from the old people, right? It's not something that Scott and I have invented. The old people had said that from the beginning, that we have to walk in two worlds. They saw a long time ago that the world was changing. So for me, it's always really about how do we do that? How is it that we can build a way of being that our knowledge could free flow between the two organizations? Also, one of the challenges that we have is the generation before me, they were the last fluent speakers. So they didn't have the benefit of the knowledge of the old people. So Scott and I, what we have made a commitment to do is try to find a way in English to translate it so the younger people can embrace the teachings of the old people so that they can walk freely in both worlds. And for us, it's really the strength of the ancestors, the strength of the land is building that resiliency and coping skills to move us. And that's what CIETSIS is really all about, is how do we move from an intellectual process into something that's more meaningful, right? When we talk about just staying in the intellect, it doesn't create an opportunity to think more deeply about things. And for us, that's the key of understanding how to work together, how to be together, so that the outcome is going to be not only sustainable, but it's going to go from one generation to the next. It's that kind of worldview that we're really striving for, is how do you stay true to ourselves? I don't ever use the term truth and reconciliation, because reconciliation is really, in my mind, it's so huge. It's such a large process, and it's very personal. So what Scott and I do in our presentations is we always say "Thantit and squall." Loosely translated, it could say like always tell the truth. But more importantly, it's how do you stay in our truth? And that's really key, because it's just from a narrow focus. It's hard from an ancestral lens. It's really important that one, you don't go strictly through the intellect, but you go through your whole body to understand things. But more importantly, you really have to focus your efforts. When we think about the way of our world and the chaos that we're experiencing, the old people would say, you'd have to determine what's important and what's urgent. So when Scott and I are out there presenting, we're all saying the work that he and I are doing is the urgent work. Lots of times people say, when we're talking about our children, they're in the middle of the room, the most vulnerable are the ones in the center of the room that we're trying to help, because that's the way of the old people, is you have to start with the most vulnerable. When Scott and I present, we say now the most vulnerable is Mother Earth herself. So we have to really rethink. And this is what it really ultimately has become. It's taken on its own life, our presentations, but really bringing us back to the land. And so it's really a huge mind shift. People think about it, say it, give it words. But like what you said in the beginning, Emilia, Scott and I are trying to find a path where it turns into actions. And more importantly, thinking about from an organizational perspective. So it can't just be individuals, but two organizations walking together. And that's what that means at Sietsas. Walking together is really a very powerful, powerful time. And so that if we can get it to a place where organizations are seeing each other as sisters, becoming real relatives, that's when we start paddling together and really seeing the movement. And the way the old people say, everything we touch will turn to gold. But it hasn't happened overnight. Like Scott said, we've been studying this way of being for years, trying to find a way for the two organizations to literally walk in two worlds.
I wanted to read from our Sietsas policy. All school districts have a strategic plan and, with certain goals around typically reading levels for students or improvement in some areas or improving grad rates or whatever it is for different school districts. And so in our strategic plan, what sits above all of that is what we call our Sietsas framework. And so that everything we do in the school district adheres to the ideas of the Sietsas policy/framework. So I just brought it up and I thought it'd be best to read a couple sentences from it so you understand what it says. It says, Sietsas, walking together, is a Hulkaminum expression for walking in two worlds, living and honoring the teachings of the land and First Peoples while navigating the ever-changing complexities of today's world and society. In today's context, Sietsas suggests we strive to find balance between the traditional way of living and the contemporary lifestyle. Sietsas begins by understanding and embracing the teachings of this land on which we live and work as a basis for our journey to truth and reconciliation. These complex knowledge systems can only be fully appreciated by first understanding and recognizing the relationship between land, language, and culture. Now, those are pretty powerful words. Now, what do they mean? Well, that's our journey. It's all to say we're trying our best to understand a different way of being, and hopefully not lumping all Indigenous people together, but trying to understand that all elements of creation can teach us, and plants, animals, rocks, other inanimate objects. If you're not brought up in that way, including some people in Snuneymuxw, as Joan teaching, some people there have lost the language, lots of people, of course, because, Joan's parents didn't want to teach her Hulkaminum because that would have been damaging to her if she spoke her language. So what I do know is that Joan and others have this profound relationship with land. We're trying to learn in that way as well. Those are difficult concepts, to have that connection with land and understand that it's a source of knowledge. I mean, just think about that for a little bit and try and explain that to somebody else, what that means. And so that's why I say, my job is to drive Joan around and open doors for her and amplify her voice.
Thanks for pointing out that sentence, that concept, Scott, because it is something I think about a lot too for non-Indigenous people. How do we understand this connection with the land that we don't have or weren't brought up with those teachings or were raised so far away from our ancestral lands that it's like so hard to even conceptualize, and yet it is essential for walking together, forward together. So I want to dive into a little bit more of some tangible, or really like, what does this look like on the ground? So you've spent a lot of time with the languaging and building out this beautiful framework. And you've both talked about how this work, it's not only the language piece, it's also an embodiment. It's a new way of it being in the world. And you've both been on that journey individually, coming together, but you're also leaders of your own organizations and of your own communities. What has been required of you, your organization, and your community to walk in this way? You've both said it's not easy. It takes work. It takes commitment. So what does that look like, or what's your experience been?
For me, it's like, I think when you started was really, what are some of those examples? does it turn into action? I think that's kind of the how to, like, many people ask Scott and I, well, how did you get there? And what is it that you're doing that's so different? Right out of the gate, he'll tell a story about we're the first school on reserve that's co-governed. So, it's really, that's how we've sort of crossed that boundary of, two different organizations that were really, really mean what we say and we say what we mean about working together. Also, in terms of the other development, he and I, as you were the T-Tuxton project, where development project, we hit the pause button to make sure that the land walks first. I think that's really key. And my heart and my mind is really keeping the land at the center. It's really easy to, as I say, put on your colonial coat and just keep doing what we've done in the past. But for us to make sure that we really begin to understand what the land means in terms of teaching and healing. And, we have Saywell Learning Academy, and that's, again, to learn is to heal and to heal is to learn. We're really, with every breath and every step, trying to bring everything back to the land. And so understanding the curative properties. And it's, our belief that once the land heals, giving her that space to heal, then she'll be able to start healing ourselves, the organization. And so from education perspective, we say education's part of a larger system. So moving it away from a siloed approach. With the development, housing is more than just putting a roof over your head. It's really understanding that our knowledge, our way of being is relational. So we say that, but what does that mean? You have to really start to put it into action and describe it a way that people understand. And that's the beauty of working with Scott. So raised in one-liners, and Scott said, well, what does that mean, Joan? And so he'll wordsmith it so the younger people can understand. And that organizational perspective is really key, that it has to be able to translate into something that could live and breathe throughout the education system, throughout Saywell organization. We could go on at length as he's doing seismic upgrades, taking an opportunity to restore, reclaim, the plants. It's just like we said, with every step, how do we bring the land back to the center? That's key, because that's where the teachings are. And if we can, get everybody to start moving in that way, it's going to be so positive for everyone.
No, I'm thinking about, listeners, and I'm thinking about people like myself, when you talk about the curative properties of the land. And I think some people think, well, okay, yeah, Indigenous people just want their land back. But it's not that. It's so much different. And it took me a long time to appreciate that and understand it. I'll say this, the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, number 57 requires us to educate public servants around the history and culture and plight of Indigenous peoples, including, education around residential schools. Joan and I started our dog and pony show. We would go out and we would talk to groups, community groups, close by universities. And originally I would affectionately call our talk Indigenous 101, right? Sharing a little bit of the history and culture and some of Joan's thinking around inherent knowledge of the land. And then, as Joan mentioned a little earlier, those talks are now more about climate change. Because as Joan says, now we have where we used to put the most vulnerable children in the center of the circle. Now we're putting Mother Nature in there. Joan talks about it from entitlement to responsibility. And I think about climate action, like what moves people to action. And so I sometimes do this little exercise with people. And that is, so I told you where I'm from. I'm from Duncan, BC. My parents were born in Edmonton, and great-grandparents from Europe, Scotland, England area. And if you're anything like me, you're interested in your lineage. Lots of people are on websites like ancestry.com or spit in a bottle and send it away to find out who they are. And my parents died relatively young, so I don't get to ask them questions. And as we get older, we're more curious, I think. Or as you have children, you're more curious about where you're from and your own history. So when I ask people to do a little exercise to trace their lineage, and give them a little time to do that. Sometimes we give them an opportunity to talk to each other about it. It typically gets emotional about where you're from, and you get deep and you talk about your grandfather in the war or other things and the struggles that they've been through maybe to get to Canada. When I ask Joan Brown where she's from, she says right here. She says this place right here for 12,000 years. Her mother, her grandmother, hundreds upon hundreds of generations. It's all here. And so when you think about the knowledge that's inherent in this land, and this land, as I think I said earlier, or Joan did, it speaks Hulkaminum. Well, everything that they are is from this land. And so when I think about that, it gives me a better, idea. As Joan says sometimes, the teachings come to the youth, but if they don't pick them up, they go back to the land because that's where everything came from originally. And so these little snippets I remember to give me a little better understanding of the types of deep things that Joan speaks of. I relate that to climate change because if you have that sort of relationship with the land, as we know, Indigenous people are leaders in being stewards of the environment. They always have been. Well, no wonder. That's a different sort of relationship to the place we live. And so when I think about inspiring people to action on climate change, they have to get that feeling, that different connection to the land, that connection where, you're connected to every living thing. I mean, how do you get there? How do you get from zero understanding to thinking we are all one, every living creature, seen and unseen? That takes time. It takes, baby steps. It takes some work. It takes intentional work. It takes, reading and listening to people like Joan and others. And that's the work we're doing here together. That's how Joan has inspired me to do this work with her. And action around climate change. We're taking real action.
Yeah, beautiful. So what becomes possible when we work in this way together? I know, Joan, you brought in the word family, that idea to the Tutuxton Project and starting to call ourselves family. You've brought up that relational language throughout our conversation today as well. And so when we start to work in that way and start to understand and deepen our relationship with the land, what is it that becomes possible?
I guess in our lived experience, I think about the brilliance of the old people. So that's what really becomes possible because they were so brilliant. You think about how they developed their minds was to the point that they could communicate without using their voice. It's just profound, the ability that they had to control the weather. But really, because we don't speak the language of the land, we don't have that same love and the passion yet. We will have it one day, but it's really, it's limitless in what we're able to accomplish. But what's key in my heart and my mind is really to getting everything to that deeper level. One thing Scott and I are working on right now is thinking about, we talked earlier about how way of being is with developing coping skills and resiliency. So I always hear Scott's voice and I go, what does that mean, Joan? So we have to translate it in a way so that people would understand. But more importantly, we think about emotion, from a mainstream perspective. They think about the negativity of, anger, grief, self-pity. But the old people knew how to harness the emotion in a positive way. So how do we use love? We don't understand how they understood that, and taking that care of each other, yourself, but ultimately to love in the same way that the land loves, so pure that it becomes powerful. And that's what we're trying to harness so that we get to that deeper understanding and using emotion as the intellect. And people say when the mind and the heart, which is the emotion, squallowing, those are really powerful times. You get to see knowledge from a different source. And that's what we're striving for, again, as individuals, but also from an organizational perspective. We want to know that it's true and meaningful, not just for today, but also the past, the present, and the future. That's the brilliance of the old people, to see one glimpse, to see the past, the present, and future in one lens. That's a real important source of knowledge. It's an important way of being. So that's what we're trying to get through to looking at it from an organizational perspective. Every time Scott and I learn something, we say, okay, how does that translate into curriculum? How does that translate into the development? So that we have to, as we prove and we're showing that we're understanding and moving, things are shown to us. Getting to a place to recognize we're not the knowers. And as soon as you can step away from that, you'd be amazed at the possibilities. But again, relying on the brilliance of the old people and ultimately the land herself.
I'm not going to add anything to that. That was well said. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Joan. So as we start to close out our circle, there are folks out there that are listening that want to step into this work that you're doing together. I'm curious if you have any words of wisdom to share with them as they take those first steps forward, or even maybe if they're in the middle of it and need to hear some encouraging words to keep going. What do you want to share with them?
Any change you make, like a New Year's resolution, requires you to be intentional. This work requires that you are intentional about your learning. So how do you do that? Well, you have to read, you have to listen, right? You need to educate yourself on as I mentioned earlier, the history and culture and plight of Indigenous peoples, hopefully in your area. You have to make connections with people like Joan and others and listen and put the time in. I read a lot. And so I could name a few books that changed my life. Unsettling the Settler Within by Paulette Reagan is one of them. Really can change your thinking around things. You could sign up or sign on to our website. It is TRC57 speakerseries.ca. And what that is we call it Learning with Siyatsas, but it's a speaker series that has Indigenous speakers on all manner of topics. It's our partnership with UBC Press and Vancouver Island Regional Libraries. We're in our third year, and we have 10 or 12 speakers, so one a month. I guess we have 10 speakers, one a month, and this is our third year. So they're all recorded online and about an hour each, and you can listen to them. Every one of those speakers has a book out. You could read the book. But it really requires that you're intentional, and you have to read. You have to, understand your own unconscious bias and privilege. And these are difficult things unless you're thinking about it and doing the work. So thank you again for having me today.
What really stands out for me often, I think about it often, and I say often, I didn't really understand. And I think everybody that's listening and all of us here today would understand really what trauma is. When we think about the pandemic, think about, the state of the climate crisis, really realizing that it's all around us. Unknowingly, it was really great to hear my husband say, I want you to walk from here, and named a spot like a couple blocks away. And he says, I want you to get to know yourself again. And that's so key, that we think that of all that's going around us, we think that we're still the same person, but we're not. It's like literally the world is crumbling around us. How could we be unchanged? It's impacting us intellectually, emotionally, physically, and more importantly, spiritually. So once you begin to turn inward, and the old people would say this is a time for introspection. Not often do we turn inward, but these are those times. And, thinking about always what's urgent and what's important. This is urgent, not only as individuals, but family, community, and the organizations. The old people would say, if we don't work together, we're not going to survive. In their time, the terrain was really harsh. It was a very wild terrain. But today we're at that same touch point. But today it's man-made. Drugs, alcohol, family violence, unemployment, poverty, all of those things that we know. But it starts, and Scott would say, it starts with me. So it's that notion of introspection. I could hear that so often from the old people. You have to really understand yourself. We tend to look outward and say, what is the problem? And I think that's really where Scott and I began understanding ourselves, and especially with our such different backgrounds, different organizations, different way of thinking. We both had to look at each other from our own perspective and how can we work together. Hasn't been easy because we were brought up differently. And it's been a life changer for me to work with Mr. Saywell. So I'm so grateful that he's so patient with me, understanding, and allowing me to be me. You need to surround yourself with people who are going to allow you to hear your voice, to really listen. Because what each of you have to say is important. Each of you are here to make a difference. It's not just Mr. Saywell, it's not just me, but all of us have a part in this narrative. It's all of us who are family. We're all related. We all could come together in a really good way. Right, Zach?
I want to leave the listener with those words. So thank you so much, Joan. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for the work that you do and who you be and how you lead and sharing these stories with us today. I know that you have changed lives. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emilia. Nice to see you again.
Hello, dear listener. Thank you for being here in this circle. If you're anything like me, you may have an urge to listen to this episode again, and I encourage you to do that. I know you might do that already, but this one in particular. It's a conversation where the words shared will have different meanings for you over time. As Joan said, we are constantly changing. And so when you hear these words tomorrow, you will hear them through who you are in that moment, which is not who you are right now. This podcast, Circle of Change, it began with a conversation on reconciliation. It was episode number 3. That was a gritty conversation that painted a picture of the ugly truth of this country and the state of the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's so fitting for me that we end Circle of Change with this conversation, which brings us further along the journey and gives us a real live example of what is possible for all of us and for this planet when we intentionally make the efforts to walk in two worlds. Given the era that we are stepping into right now, there's no better time for this journey. Joan and Scott share so many words of wisdom on how to be the change from 2 different worldviews. And I wanted to pull out some questions for you to ponder and really sit with. How can you use your emotional, your physical, your spiritual body to understand your life experiences, not just your intellect? What are you focusing your energy on? What is important or what is urgent? And how can you make small shifts towards that which is most urgent? What are you learning about yourself, your ancestry? And what are you reading that opens and expands your worldview? What are your natural surroundings telling you about life and how to love? In what ways have you changed over the last few years? And who are the people you are surrounded by? And do they create space to hear your story? Find what resonates for you in this moment, get curious, and let the exploration begin to shift how you see and show up in the world. If you want to do this work but don't want to do it alone, we have the perfect opportunity for you. On April 13th, 2023, we are launching our first 12-week Reclaim Your Life Force immersion, where we are going to join together in circle with changemakers to deeply get to know ourselves, to explore some of the questions that Joan and Scott have left with you today, and to grow and hone these ways of being that are necessary for you to step forward in your life and create change in a way that aligns with the ancient teachings. If you're interested in that, there is a link in the show notes. We start April 13th. I would love for you to join me. I look forward to being with you in our next and our final episode of Circle of Change. I love you. Ciao. I'm now passing the talking piece to you. If you feel called to put your voice in the circle, please head to humconsulting.ca/podcast and share your story there. I cannot wait to hear what has come up for you as you have listened to what has been shared here today. I wish you love and joy beyond your wildest imagination. Thank you so much for being here in the Circle of Change. I also want to express my gratitude to the following peeps. Circle of Change is recorded on Lekwungen territories, and I am so grateful to live on this land. Our opening and closing music was created by the talented E-Roll Beats. You can find his creations at erollbeats.com. And special thanks to my coach, Mary Chan of Organized Sound Productions, for bringing this podcast to life. Until next time, ciao.